The first Obscure was a fun game that not only poked fun at the popular teen horror subgenre at the time of its release, but it was also a game that was way ahead of its time, featuring a co-op mechanic that would subsequently become a standard feature in practically every horror and non-horror game in the 7th generation of gaming. While this sequel may use the foundation built by its predecessor, its few changes and additions make it feel like a different game entirely. But is it good or bad? Well, that's what we're here to find out. Set 2 years after the events of the first game, you take on the shoes of multiple students thrust into another horrifying situation caused by a strange flower that turns everyone who uses it as a drug into a hideous creature. This sequel story is mainly driven by the newly introduced characters, Corey, May, Jin, Sven, and Amy. Though instead of being based on genre tropes, these new characters are instead fully original. Well, they try anyway. Some of the survivors of the first game such as Stan, Kenny, and Shannon also make a return. Each of the cast has its own set of abilities based on their character's stereotypes and past. Corey can perform acrobatic acts, May can hack security locks, Sven and Kenny can do the heavy lifting, Amy can solve puzzles, Stan can lockpick, and Shannon has the ability to remove spores. In the first game, many of the characters can permanently die and the story would still continue. But in this sequel, everything is a lot more linear. The story is already predetermined, meaning many of the playable characters can only canonically die in the story and not during gameplay. As a result, every main character's death is shocking and completely unexpected, made much more by the fact that every death is gruesome. Instead of exploring one giant school building as in the first game, Obscure 2 instead takes you to a variety of locations, such as an abandoned hospital or a creepy lake. One thing I loved about the first game was that almost everything was destructible, and it played a part in dispatching enemies. It was a minor detail but it contributed a lot to the immersion. For the sequel, however, many of the items around the levels remain static, with little to no interactability. Many of the hallways are also filled with doors that cannot be opened. There are sometimes 4 or 5 doors in a single hallway, but only 2 of them can be used. This would have been fun, but since there's not a single map in the game to indicate which ones can be entered, it's so easy to get lost. It's always a guessing game when I return to a room because I would often have no idea which ones are the ones I've entered before. Although the indoors may be confusing, at least they were better designed than the outer areas. You'll barely be able to see where you're supposed to go in these places, even though the paths are always linear and very straightforward.
They've killed my boyfriend! It will soon be your turn!
One great thing about the first game was its exceptional atmosphere that made exploring the school seem far grander. Obscure 2's atmosphere and soundtrack, however, leave a lot to be desired. Instead of the amazing orchestra, the sequel instead uses Silent Hill as an inspiration for its atmosphere. It's all very obvious from its very first scares and some of its music. It also puts more emphasis on blood and gore, making the game feel like just another horror game that was never really that scary as a result. Walking through the various locations simply isn't as effective. I've played a few games with stiff and clunky controls before, but I doubt anything will ever beat the awkward controls in this game. From the very first moment you get to control the game, heck, even by just watching gameplay of it, you'll know something isn't quite right with the camera. Moving it just a little bit causes the camera to go all over the place, and that's just when nothing is even happening. When combat does occur, you'll have the experience of witnessing the most disorientating camera ever in a video game.
Ow! Why are you doing that?
Most of the time, it will abstract your view from what's happening and would often get stuck in places. Although this change of perspective did make for a more engaging combat and actually made the first game look boring in comparison. However, I would still prefer fixed camera any day. It just seems like the game isn't sure how it wants to present itself. There are instances when it's a fixed camera, then sometimes it's dynamic but still fixed, and then there are times when it's completely controllable. It's just overall messy and made for a very inconsistent presentation. It's made even worse by the fact that the mouse cursor doesn't disappear when you start playing. But hey, at least the game now supports mouse controls.
I like to see you work out.
Yeah, does it make you all hot and sweaty for me?
The gameplay in Obscure is largely the same as in the original game, with a few alterations for good measure. The game still focuses on co-op, and the characters still have their own specific skills. However, many of the features that were retained feel far worse than before. As mentioned earlier, the story is now predetermined, so the option of being able to choose your favorite character for a specific scenario is kind of no longer possible. You can still switch as your partner character, and when the group does meet up in some occasions, you can still swap them out. Although, because the puzzles require a specific character to be solved, its inclusion feels rather pointless. You will not be able to progress through the game without playing as the character that the game wants you to. Even then, you'll still be forced to backtrack since you wouldn't really know if a certain character will be needed for a puzzle. There's really no other way around the character-specific puzzles because the game is very linear. As a result, there's no experimentation at all. As for the partner character, their AI, if you're playing solo, seems much dumber this time around, as they love to block your path whether you're just trying to go somewhere or if you're being attacked by enemies, which caused me to die numerous times.
Amy!
When you're fighting an enemy, the AI would barely even help, and when they do, they'll just waste the precious ammo. There are even some instances where the AI was so stupid that it couldn't even figure out how to go down a step. The first game could be played solo with barely any problems, but this one really requires another human companion, or else you'll just be screwed by the AI. What's worse is that if the partner character dies, it means game over. You can no longer continue playing the game solo.
Amy! Say something! Amy!
The combat has a larger emphasis on melee due to the resources being extremely rare. Like, way too rare. I'd only just started and was around 30 minutes into the game, and yet I've already died numerous times on a single level because of the game's lack of healing items or ammo. And this went on until I was halfway through and the game was finally confident enough to provide me healing items. But even then, I often still found myself needing them, particularly during the final boss, where I literally had nothing, not even an ammo. Because of the rare resources, my characters are always on the verge of death.
Amy! No!
Sven, no!
I had no means of healing or protecting myself at all. There was even a time where a new level had just started, and the character already died not even 10 seconds in, because I had no healing item. The game even had the audacity of placing an enemy literally in front of the door that we came from, which means it instantly attacked us before I even had a chance to control the characters. Because of all of this, I actually thought that I accidentally set the game's difficulty to hard by mistake, only to find out that this is actually how the game is. Unlike the first game, you can no longer save whenever you want. Instead, save stations can only be found at the beginning and end of a level. So if you die, you'll be forced to replay through its entirety. This often leads to numerous frustrating moments like this one, where we were already in the next level but there was no save station in sight. So when one of the characters died while playing the new level, we were forced to reload to the previous level's save file, which was before the boss. And the game also has an unskippable cutscene, so each time we died, not only were we forced to replay a large section of the game, but also watch the cutscene in its entirety, all because the save stations are so spread out. At least the puzzles actually provide a bit of variety, breaking up the monotony of the game. It does, however, have a few flaws. In this case, they were simply way too cryptic. Many of the minigame puzzles were completely random, with no given instructions on how to play or solve them, making them way more tedious than they should be. While I may have continuously bashing the game's flaws, it isn't exactly all that bad. It does present a few neat ideas that make it better to play than the first game. Well, for starters, the game now has a dedicated inventory system, which makes switching items much easier and faster. And as mentioned earlier, many of the enemy encounters are now much more captivating and makes the game feel much faster paced as a result. Despite the fact that it's a sequel, it still doesn't feel quite polished. It still has a few minor and not so minor game-breaking bugs that often go in the way of enjoyment. There was an instance where my character's weapon would disappear from their hand when I needed it to progress to the next area, leaving me stuck. What's worse was that it happened while the game was on a timer. But perhaps the most game-breaking bug that I've come across is when the screen would go completely black for no apparent reason. It seemed to happen every time I was in a boss fight, and the only way of fixing it was to restart the level, which meant I had to replay a massive section of the game. While playing through Obscure 2, I was frequently tempted to just uninstall and refund it due to all of its problems, from its game design to its various bugs. The entire time, all I could think was that it's an inferior sequel that stripped away everything that made the original great. There's not a single ounce of replayability, unlike the first game, as there's nothing new to acquire or discover at all for your second playthrough, as you pretty much discovered everything in your first. Despite this though, I managed to power my way through and ended up living entertained. Sure, you'll have to endure a lot, but if you manage to stay tuned like I did, you'll discover a fun but very flawed game. Although I don't suggest playing the PC version at all, and instead I'd rather recommend the PS2, PSP or the Wii ports.